Hi, Brian Behm for Red Giant, here to talk about some of the new features in Trapcode Form, part of Trapcode Suite Release 15. So the big new thing in Trapcode Form is fluid dynamics, where particles behave as if they're suspended in fluid. With fluid physics, you can create really beautiful organic animations in a way that you've really never been able to before in After Effects. And probably the coolest thing is that fluid systems can interact with each other. Let's dive into the designer and take a look. So remember, whenever we're setting up something in Trapcode Form, we can use all of the normal twirl downs in After Effects to be able to adjust the form settings. But we've got this great designer to be able to kind of better visualize what's going on with our form setups. One quick change to the designer in Trapcode 15 is this blue progress bar. So if we make a change, let's go into our fractal field and just displace an X. And if we hit play, you'll see that as it goes through the animation, it's just going to show us where in time we are. And it's just a great way to be able to kind of visualize time. So let's set our displacement back to 0 and we'll check out the new fluids. So there is a new block inside of the designer called fluids. And if we click that and enable fluid motion and go back and hit play, instantly we see our form particle grid flowing upwards and breaking apart. But let's make it a little cooler. So if we go into our type and we're going to go and switch to an OBJ model, and if we go and choose OBJ, there's still this really great collection of models that come with Trapcode Form as a way to get started. And we're going to go grab the buckyball, just because it's fun to say. And immediately, we've got a more interesting animation going on. So the fluid physics are really helped out by having something that has X, Y, and Z space. So if we go and change this to faces and bring our particle density down a little bit, maybe 20. And then let's go into color. We're going to select the color block and go into presets. And let's check this neon noir. And now let's go back and play and see what happens. Now we have our colorful buckyball floating upwards. So by default, the fluid force is set to buoyancy and swirl only. Let's take a look at how to adjust these settings and what's going on. So the first thing we're going to look at is this UI that's included as part of the designer. So this box is representing the area where the force is being applied. So if we move this around, you can see that the force is being applied inside of that cube. We can also use the camera to be able to pan around. So if we click the camera and then click C to bring up the rotation, you can see that we can move that camera around where the field is and see how it's affecting the field. So let's reset our position. We can also scale down the region scale and affects a smaller area. Or we can scale it up and make it affect an even bigger area. So why are the particles moving up? The particles are moving up because they have buoyancy. The particles are suspended in a liquid. And so if they're lighter than the liquid and they have a higher buoyancy rating, they're going to want to move up that much more quickly. You can think of it like bubbles in a can of soda. The bubbles are rising to the top. So if we bring this buoyancy up from 5 to, say, 40 and click play, you're going to see those bubbles rise a lot faster. And if we bring the buoyancy down and set it to a negative value, and you'll also notice that as we adjust these settings, the higher the value, the wider the arrow. And the arrow is also indicating which direction the particles are going to fall. So if we have a positive number, we can see that the particles are rising up And this is a particularly strong value, so that arrow is really fat. But if we bring it down again, now when we hit play, we should see those particles drop. And I like to think about those like coins, dropping coins into a big bucket of water. If we set the buoyancy to 0, the particles aren't going to do much of anything. They're still suspended in the fluid, but they're the same weight as the fluid. And so they're really not moving around a whole lot. But if we do have 0 and we want them to move around, we could start to introduce some swirl. And swirl is kind of like turbulence in the liquid. So you could almost think about it like putting a stir stick into the bucket and turning it. And as you churn it, it's creating kind of distortion and noise inside of the fluid. So a higher value is going to create a stronger response. And a smaller value is going to be much more subtle. We've also got this swirl scale. And if we scale up the swirl, it's going to get much more complicated and it's going to run more slowly, but it's going to have much more detail. So in swirl scale, the higher the number that you have, the more detailed the look, and the lower number you have, the bigger and broader the distortion is. We can also separate our swirl values. So if we click on random swirl and go to XYZ individual, now you can see that it's only applying on the X. So if we turn that down to 0 and have it only apply on the Y, that's going to change that effect. Or we could have it on the Z and the Y. So let's maybe crank the scale up to make it more detailed. And you can also adjust the animation by plugging in another random seed. So if you want to kind of change things up, say you've got multiple copies of the same system and you want the animation to be different, all you need to do is plug in a different random seed. It's also a great way to kind of art-directed animation where you like the general look of something, but it's not quite right, and you can just play with these random seed numbers until you have something that you're really happy with. So let's take a look at another example of using swirl in only one dimension. I've got a base form here. I'm going to bring that down to 1, and then we're going to adjust this up to 1,000, and then we will go down to particles in X and Y and set that to 150. And let's go give it a color. We'll go into the color presets and select orange to blue. And then I'm going to map it over Y. And now let's go back to our fluids and we'll enable fluid motion. We're going to turn our buoyancy to 0. And then we're going to go to random swirl here and go to XYZ individual. And now if we crank this up in the random swirl Z and hit play, you'll see that we're only affecting it in one dimension. You could maybe use this to simulate paint in a pan or maybe something that you're looking at through a microscope. There's lots of possibilities. Another thing to note about fluids is that as we make adjustments, it's going to recache our simulation, and that's going to be highlighted by this light gray bar racing across the screen. So as you make your scene more complex, that line is going to take longer to generate. So if we switch this up to 500 and 500, you'll see that it slows down our simulation. But most of the time when you're experimenting, you're barely going to notice the gray bar racing across the screen at all. So next, let's take a look at apply force and force lifetime. And what apply force does is we have two options. We have continuously and at start. So if we select at start, that's going to create kind of a blast of force right at the beginning, and then no more additional forces after that. So if we take a look at this, you can see at the beginning, it's initiating the random swirl that we created, but it's not adding anything extra after that. It's basically just saying, this is what's happening. Whereas if we take apply force and we switch it to continuously, and we bring force lifetime down to something really small like 1 or 2, then every couple of seconds, in this case, it's going to reintroduce another dose of those fluid forces. And so over time, you'll see that this gets to be much more turbulent than it would otherwise. So if we bring that down to 1, every 1 second, it's going to introduce more forces. Let's switch that back to at start so you can see the difference again. So you can see that the same random swirl value creates a much different effect because it's only being applied once versus being applied continuously. We'll pull that up side by side so that you can see them next to each other. So there you can see a much clearer distinction as to what's going on. So there are 3 other fluid force settings that we need to take a look at. And the next one's called Vortex Ring. And pay attention to the grayed out areas underneath random seed. As soon as we make Vortex Ring active, it's going to turn those on. So in Vortex Ring, particles are moved through a ring full of vortex forces. You can sort of picture it like a whirlpool. And if we go down to Vortex Tilt and Rotate, we can reorient that to be able to kind of see that it's a disk. And the UI changes from the box to the disk with these arrows that are indicating the direction that the vortex is spinning in. So if we go ahead and hit play, we will take a look at what that looks like. You can see that it is taking the particles and they have a buoyancy that makes them want to rise. And this force that's spinning around the tube is creating this motion that is causing the particles to kind of curl up under each other as they're pushed up. So vortex strength is going to be just how fast those forces are spinning. And you'll see the arrows get wider or narrower based on how strong the effect is. And negative values are going to cause the particles to go downwards. So if we bring back our camera again, you can see them spinning down. So Vortex Tilt and Vortex Rotate allow you to control the orientation of the animation. So if you want that force to be pointed in a different way, you can do that. We can also move where the vortex is happening. This would be a great thing that you could animate outside of the designer. And we'll take a look at that in a few minutes. We can also adjust the core size. So as that gets bigger, it's going to be a smaller ring that's causing the forces, but a bigger hole to push those particles through. And as it's smaller, those rings are going to be much bigger. So as it gets bigger, you can see that there's much less room for these particles to go through, and they're mostly just going up because there's no room. So if we go back and make that size bigger, you'll see that the hole can again push particles through. Let's take a look at visualize relative density. So there's 2 settings in here. There's opacity and brightness and off. Let's switch that to opacity. So visualize relative density controls how the particles are visualized in relation to the combined density of the particles and the fluid forces surrounding them. So that's kind of complicated, but let's break that down. So if we have a lot of particles and there are a lot of forces going on, so there are a lot of forces in and around this vortex, and so anywhere that there are a lot of forces and interaction going on, opacity is going to make those areas more opaque. And in the areas where there's less going on, those particles are going to get more transparent. So if we go back to type and let's just change the particle density up so that you can better visualize. So in these areas where there is less fluid motion happening and the particles are a little more spread out, you're going to see those areas get more transparent. And in these areas, these are going to be like 100% opacity because there's a lot of stuff going on in there. We've also got brightness. And I end up using brightness a lot because I really like how it sort of works like a transfer mode, like add or screen or hard light, but it doesn't get rid of the darker bits. And so it sort of works like both a transfer mode and an ambient occlusion. And so now anywhere where there's a lot of forces and a lot of particles, it's going to get brighter. And in areas where there are not a lot of forces and not a lot of particles, that area is going to get darker. So if we change our preset over to something like fire, and let's map that over Y. And let's increase our particle density some more. And if we play that back, you can see that we're getting some bright hotspots and we're getting some darkness where the forces are less. And it's a really cool effect. Let's go ahead and zoom our camera out and play that back so you can see it. And that's looking pretty cool. So next we're going to take a look at the Vortex Tube. So the Vortex Tube has all of the same settings that the Vortex Ring has, but instead of acting like a whirlpool that's sucking stuff up or pushing things down, the tube ends up being much more cyclonic, and it's like a tornado in that it's spinning these particles around and around and around. If we tilt this so that we can get a look at the tube a bit better, and let's go back to our camera and zoom out. So now that we've zoomed out, you can see that the UI changes from our ring, where the forces are going around clockwise and counterclockwise, to some discs that are representing that this is a tube. So this is the outer edge of the tube, and this is the inner edge of the tube. So you can think about this inner circle as sort of the eye of the hurricane. So if we scale vortex core size up, you're going to see that the area where the forces are being applied is a much thinner section of the outer ring of the tube. And if we shrink down the eye, you'll see that more of the particles are being affected inside of the volume. We have the same strength settings where as we turn up the amount, you're going to see those arrows get bigger and bigger and bigger. And if we go to negative values, you're going to see the arrows turn around and the particles will start to go the other way. So if we go to force region scale and turn that down, so let's go down to maybe 30%, you can see that it is affecting the particles in a very different way. Like the size of our cyclone is smaller, and it's still affecting these particles out here, but on a much smaller scale, because it's really the residual forces of the particles in here that are being affected. And those forces are sort of rippling out. So if you throw a rock into a pond, the ripples are going to grow and dissipate and get softer as they spread out. And these fluids are very gently affecting the outer reaches of this system. So one of the cool things about all these settings is that they're keyframeable outside of the designer. So if we were to take the relative position and move it right, you can see that we can animate the position of the forces. So fluid dynamics have individual settings, and that's what we've been playing with, but they also have global settings which control all the fluids. You can think about it like a set of controls that control the nature of the tank of the liquid. FYI, if you're working with more than one fluid system, the global controls will only be found in the master system. So the first setting that we're going to look at is fluid time factor. So right now it's set to 1, and that means that we're basically playing back in real time. If we go to 0.5, you'll see that we've scaled down temporally in time the fluid settings so that they're running at half speed. Basically, it allows you to speed up or slow down the animation of all the fluid interactions. And this is keyframeable in After Effects. So over time, you could create a matrix effect, or you could go crazy and have it speed up. So in fluid time factor, you basically have control of time and space. Next, we have viscosity. And viscosity is basically the thickness of the fluid. So if we turn that up, it's going to be going through much thicker fluid like a syrup or a molasses. And if we scale it down, there's going to be very little resistance at all. And finally, simulation fidelity. So simulation fidelity is going to be how precise the simulation is. So if we go to 1, it's going to be a very rough sim, but it's going to run very fast. And if we crank that up all the way to 10, it's going to have to think a lot longer, but there's going to be much more detail to the simulation. So far we've been looking at single systems, but the real power of all of this fluid stuff is when you use multiple systems together. So let's go to our master form and let's duplicate it to create a second one. And let's go in and we're going to change our color to teal. And then let's go in and move that down. So we'll take our relative position and move it towards the bottom of the screen. And now in our fluids, we're going to go from -10 sinking to +10 rising. And when we hit play, you're going to see them smash into each other. That's pretty cool. Every time I watch one of these for the first time, I get kind of excited, and there's a little geeky part of me that does a little dance. So another thing to keep in mind is that making systems invisible doesn't make them inactive. If you switch the eyeball off, we're still seeing the visible system interacting with the invisible system. This could be super useful in a VFX shot where you want to make it look like your fluid particles are interacting with the surface. So you can also mix forces. So if we go to fluid force and set it to Vortex Ring and maybe scale that up a little bit, and now when we hit play, you're going to see it interact in a different way. One thing to keep in mind, if you want to see the UI for the forces, you need to make sure that you're clicked on the fluid block. If you're in the base form or any of the other blocks that aren't fluid, it's going to go away. Now we have one more fluid force to take a look at, and that's none. So let's go to our second form again, and we'll go to fluids, and we're going to select none. And let's move that up a little bit. And basically what none is going to do is those particles are just going to kind of be there, and they're not going to be doing a whole lot. And they're going to be waiting for whatever else is happening inside of the fluid to happen. So let's take a look. So they're basically reactionary. They're waiting for the orange particles to arrive, and they're going, hey, what am I supposed to do? So let's go back to our After Effects composition and look at some of the settings there. So now we're back in After Effects, and all of the settings that we were just looking at in the designer are still available here. So if we go to our effects control panel and we twirl down show forms, you're going to see that we have the two forms that we set up, and they are in master and form. So if we click form 2, We can scroll down and all of our fluids are here. So we can see that it's set to none. We can see the grayed out settings because it's set to none. And in our master form, this is where our global fluid controls are. So if we wanted to create our bullet time thing, we could move forward and set a keyframe and come forward again. And let's set that to 0.125. Hit U to bring the keyframes up. Let's set another keyframe at 0.125. And then a few frames later, let's put it back to 1. And when we play it back, you can see we've got our slow motion effect. So here's one other setup that I did that has a whole bunch of fluid systems that are all interacting with each other, and an OBJ that I modeled in Cinema 4D and exported. And I've got a system keyframed that is moving right to left. I've got one that's going left to right. And then I've got another two that are in the back and shooting forward. Let's go take a quick look in the designer. So if we unsolo, and remember they continue to affect even if they're not visible. There's 4 different setups that are all heading for this text. And the text is set to none. And as soon as they hit, you'll see the animation that we created. Before we wrap up, let's take a look at some of the new presets that are included with this release of Form. Okay, we're back in the designer. So if we go into the upper left where our presets are, we've got both single form presets and multiple form presets. And if we go to fluid, we can see that there are several single options. And if we click over to multiple, we see that we have several options in here as well. And all of these are customizable and you can tweak them to your heart's content. We've also got fluid blocks to help you get started with setting up your own systems. So both form and particular have fluids, but they work a little bit differently. In form, our particles are constant and they're always there, and they're inside of the fluid. In particular, it's more like a hose that's been jammed into the liquid and it's shooting particles out into the fluid. They're both equally powerful, but they do different things. And so depending on what effect you're trying to create, you might want to use one versus the other.